Good afternoon. I must say I'm really delighted to be here. It's my first time in Trinidad, and I've had a very warm welcome here so far. So, hello.
Can you hear?
No,
I don't think so.
of course not.
Yeah.
Is it? I don't know if it's... Okay.
I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. I don't want to burst your head or anything. But let's try.
Okay. How's that? Better?
Yes.
Yes. I speak very quietly anyway, sorry. Okay. As I was saying, I'm delighted to be here in Trinidad, and I've received a very warm welcome. I'm amazed at how many librarian and archivist colleagues have come up to me and said they took their training at the University of Toronto, so it feels very comfortable to be here. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about the Walcott Papers, which I realize is a hot topic for some people. The politics of location is extremely appropriate in this case. So why are the Derek Walcott Papers, or a portion of them, held at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library in the University of Toronto? Well, it's not quite as strange as you might think. Some of the major factors are, one, he was willing and interested in having them come to us. We did a lot of fundraising to acquire the funds to purchase them because he was interested in arranging a purchase of the papers. We don't normally have a large acquisition budget to purchase either, despite what some people may think, so it took a great deal of coordination, discussion, and convincing, and fundraising. As some of you may know, and some of you may not, there's a very large Caribbean diasporic community in the Toronto area, and they were very supportive of this idea, as well as of other Caribbean authors' archives coming to the University of Toronto. We also have the papers of Lorna Goodison, Dr. Afua Cooper, and Rudyard Fearon, who's a Jamaican-Canadian poet. And it's not quite as strange as you might think, though of course there's room for discussion, and I was interested in hearing the word repatriation today, which could be very complicated. There's Derek Walcott and Sigrid Nama, his partner. Sure. It's just flipping through a bit, that's all. Just some images, yeah. Authors' papers, like authors themselves, migrate all over the world. Frequently, they can be found in unexpected locations, just as authors themselves may temporarily or permanently relocate for all kinds of reasons, so do their papers. These reasons may include chance, disaster, financial reasons, safety and security, and even a passionate fan base, which may convince them to move to a certain location for a time. The simple, obvious argument is that authors' papers should be held by institutions in the author's home and native land. And as we've been discussing this morning, there are a number of reasons why that hasn't happened in some cases. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to pursue that as a first option. A comparable example from the Canadian side that occurred to me is Margaret Atwood. We hold her papers at the University of Toronto, which seems appropriate. If her papers were held in another country, I think there would be quite a bit of comment because she's a Canadian icon, and she's very connected to Toronto and the University of Toronto. So we completely understand. By way of reassurance, I would say, we don't have a complex application process to use the library. People come from all over the world to consult the Walcott Papers, and we try to be as accommodating as we can to assist them in their research. You can just flip just the next one. We don't require any special letter of permission.
It seems to be very complicated.
And we are open to the public as well, so anyone is welcome to come. We've had researchers from Puerto Rico, from France, from Italy, a number from the Caribbean. Jean herself has spent I think, a few months working with us in the Walcott papers. But we do realize the always problematic issue of those who cannot secure funding and time to visit, but that's always true in the world. It's always an issue for archival research. Let's see. Walcott himself is a self-described economic exile. So while he now resides in St. Lucia, his birthplace, he lived for decades here in Trinidad, the United States, and elsewhere in the world, mostly for financial reasons, he would say. While there's no doubt that he's a citizen of St. Lucia in the Caribbean, he's also a global citizen. And I think his work reflects his complex identity, its African-European elements to his heritage as well. This is shown in his work. As he writes in the Gulf, he says, "I am your poet, yours," which could be interpreted as being a Caribbean poet or a poet of the world. In his work, he's always of and for the people. All people is my impression. His work reflects his habit of writing in relation to specific geographic locations and peoples responding to his environment of the moment. For example, he describes the writing of Omoros as an act of gratitude for St. Lucia, the people, the weather, and the life I've lived there. This statement describes so much of his work in a sense, varying the locations and cultures he's speaking of each time. Dr. Jean-Antoine Dunn writes in her introduction to Interlocking Basins of the Globe, Walcott soars, yet remains grounded in the care and love of his original place. His work and life reflect the duality of himself and his experience as he moves through the world, constantly moving back and forth between the Caribbean and the New World with their inherent tensions and compromises. Like so many, Walcott has experienced a conflicted relationship to home. One of the questions by Kim this morning, or comments, was related to the Louise Bennett Archive, which is another very political collection. I also just wanted to mention the Salman Rushdie Archives, which ended up at Emory University in Atlanta. And there are a number of other examples. Another Canadian example, again, at the Fisher Library, we hold the Leonard Cohen papers. Now, really, those should have gone to McGill in Montreal, but they were offered the papers at the time in the 1960s, and they weren't interested. They weren't interested in purchasing them, so it was a poor decision on their part. And University of Toronto was interested and did find the money to buy them. So we like to think that we enjoy a very warm relationship with our colleagues at UE, and we have very mildly discussed the possibility of some kind of joint digital archives online, perhaps, of our holdings. We haven't done very much in practical terms yet, but this is a good opportunity to start discussing that again. Mrs. Kathleen Helenese Paul visited us in the early 2000s, and we had some opportunity for some good discussions then. In 2011, I prepared an exhibition of Derek Walcott's papers based on our holdings and wrote the catalog, and we had a nice launch. And I was really struck by the fact when we asked him who we should invite, he gave us a number of family members and friends, and they were all in the Greater Toronto area. So in his own way, he is connected to the place. In Christopher's presentation, I recognized a number of names that we're familiar with in Toronto, such as Dion Brand, who was the Poet Laureate of Toronto. Ramabai Espinet teaches at the University of Toronto. There are various letters and other references in some of our other collections regarding Harold Sonny Ledoux, including in the Dennis Lee papers, and several other collections, Graham Gibson, I believe. We also hold some papers of the Trinidad Theatre Workshop just a small portion. I think the bulk of them are here. And that was related to the acquisition of the Walcott papers. The person really spearheading the purchase of the Walcott papers by Toronto is Professor J. Edward Chamberlain, who's a friend of Walcott's and felt passionate about it, did a lot of the fundraising and the negotiations. So without him, I don't think that it would have happened. He was in discussion with Sir Alistair McIntyre, trying to make sure that that would be acceptable, somewhat acceptable to people at UE as well. So, also, Edward Chamberlain and Edward Baugh nominated Walcott for the Nobel Prize successfully. So they've been his great supporters, and partly for their own reasons, they felt it would be good to have some of the Walcott papers held by University of Toronto. So, I just want to show you some examples of his work. Oh, it's jumping. Yeah. And these are from O Babylon, Steele, and Marie Laveau. A lot of our holdings pertain more to, except for these first, to his more North American writings. Marie Laveau is based in New Orleans. We have a manuscript for Viva Detroit and a number of other plays and that sort of thing. These we actually purchased from a friend of Walcott's who he'd sold some of these paintings and drawings in the early 70s to raise some money, and it turns out she lived right behind the library. She just walked in one day and said, "Would you be interested in purchasing these from us?" So you just never know. There's quite a strong connection between Toronto and the Caribbean, much stronger than people realize. My own personal interest, I have a passion for Caribbean literature and poetry. In my first library job in Toronto, I was hired by Dr. Rita Cox, who I'm sure some of you have heard of. And the library that I worked in was in a Caribbean neighborhood, and we had strong Caribbean poetry and literature collections there. Look quickly. There you go. There we go. She's trying to, okay. All right. So that's sort of a type of apology and reassurance. And I would be happy to hear any questions or comments about this.
We'll have questions at the end of both.
After, okay.
Both